TopMedTalk.
Well, hello and welcome to TopMedTalk. I'm your host, Desiree Chappell, and I'm joined by my co-host, Editor-in-Chief, Monty Mythen in London, England. You know, on TopMedTalk, we've had lots of speakers, lots of conversation about delirium, post-op cognitive dysfunction, and this whole idea. And so we thought it would be great to partner with iDelirium, which is an international multidisciplinary collaborative with the primary mission to act as an advocate for delirium awareness with a unified voice. So here today, joining us is the co-founder, one of the co-founders of iDelirium, Rakesh Arora. Hello, Rakesh.
Hi, good day. How are you?
Good. It's so wonderful of you to join us. Tell us, where are you coming to us from?
So my name is again Rakesh Arora. I'm a cardiac surgeon, intensive care medicine specialist in Winnipeg, Manitoba, in Canada. I've been an advocate and interested in delirium now for the better part of a decade, and a past president of the American Delirium Society, and along with Alasdair and a few others, a co-founder of the International Federation of Delirium Societies, or iDelirium for short. And I'd love to have my two other fellow colleagues introduce themselves as well. Maybe Heidi, we'll start with you.
So I'm so excited and honored to be here. My name is Heidi Lindra. I'm a nurse scientist at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. Just started at Mayo Clinic. I'm a developing early career scientist, and it's been fantastic to be involved with iDelirium. It's really helped me connect with people all over the world who are passionate about delirium. And my program of research is focused on delirium, and I also work in the medical ICU at the bedside.
Fantastic. And Alasdair?
Hi, thanks very much for having us today. So I'm Alasdair Macclullich. I'm a professor of geriatric medicine at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. About half of my time is working clinically with hip fracture patients, where I see a lot of delirium, of course. Another half is doing research and education. And I've got a long-standing interest in delirium with my friends here on the podcast, with European Delirium Association starting in 2006, and then the Scottish Delirium Association in 2011, and then iDelirium followed that. And the job of these societies is really just to get people together, to share research ideas, but a huge part of what we do is to share information about delirium to people who maybe aren't so familiar with it, especially clinicians.
Tell us a little bit about how you formed and all the different people that are involved.
So, very appropriate for St. Paddy's Day. As most things, good conversations happened over pints after a meeting. So several of us were in London in 2015 in the fall, September, and there was a combined meeting with the European Delirium Association as well as the British Geriatric Society. And one of the talks within that was from the group from Alzheimer's, and talking their roadmap from going from being a relatively small interest group to being at the level of interaction with the World Health Organization. And we sat in the audience really quite, impressed by the relatively compressed timeline they went from point A to point B. And as we're sitting and discussing that over dinner that evening, we said, well, why can't we do the same? And that really was a nexus of that conversation, was how do we get ourselves to that level of global awareness of the impact of delirium, which impacts, as we'll talk about, many more patients than Alzheimer's disease. And then how do we band together with the various different societies we have to generate a unified voice around this issue? And that's where it started. So we registered the website after we came up with the name on my phone in that particular restaurant, and kind of came up with 3 major goals that have expanded to 5 over the last few years on the back of a table napkin. And the first one was, as you mentioned already, to be an advocate for delirium with a unified voice with all of us in the various parts of the world that we represent, building a global understanding of the economic implications of delirium, and collaborate to advance science pertaining to delirium and delirium research. In addition, what we've evolved into is developing international programming. Heidi has been a major force behind this. We can talk a little bit about the fantastic work we're doing this year for World Delirium Awareness Day, and also provide materials that have been translated to a number of different languages from all our various partners for patients, caregivers, professionals alike, as well as policymakers around delirium overall, with really the overall goal of trying to find ways that we can learn to mitigate the effects of delirium on the lives and independence of patients and families and healthcare professionals.
Getting a whole load of societies to work together is sometimes a challenge. I know it shouldn't be, but sometimes it can be. So it sounds as though, I think you've got the wording in some of your websites there, it's a sort of confederation, it's a big tent, it's a big hug. It's not a secondary controlling structure in some way. It's a kind of...
That's a really good point. I mean, the whole part of where this came from was to be very agenda-free. We all may come from Delirium with our own research ideologies that were somewhat the same, perhaps, or maybe actually be divergent. But the goals here were really to provide a unified approach that awareness was the first step that we had to start with globally. And that's really what brought us together. And we've been very lucky, and I've been very happy to meet many of these people who don't typically live in the surgical world, which is where most of my time is, with people who are generally very engaged in this area. And that made the conversations, therefore, very easy. As you mentioned, you often with various different sort of viewpoints from different areas may lead to perhaps some conflict or perhaps worse, division. But in fact, we've been very much kind of lumped together with the same ideology that this was important, and we kind of moved together down the same way, rowing in the same direction at the outset.
On TopMedTalk, we've had a lot of conversations about the nomenclature of it all. Like what are we actually talking about? And Rakesh, we had just had a conversation at the ERAS Cardiac Society about this. And so Alasdair, I thought as a geriatrician, talk to us a little bit, because delirium is not the same as dementia, is not the same as Alzheimer's. There's a lot of different words when it comes to confusion for people. So walk us through a little bit about your definition for delirium for the society.
Sure. Yeah. Well, delirium is in DSM-5. It's been in DSM for quite a few generations now. And the key difference between delirium and dementia, of course, is onset, with delirium coming on over hours or days mostly, and often resolving within 3 or 4 days, although about 20% of delirium continues. And dementia generally has a much slower onset and mostly is irreversible. So these are the key differences between the two. I think with respect to the terminology, Ken Rockwood, a famous geriatrician in Canada, came up with this phrase, terminological chaos, to describe, delirium, acute confusional state, all sorts of terms, septic encephalopathy or encephalopathy if you're in North America. Even subacute befuddlement was somebody's serious suggestion for what delirium could be. So it's been it is funny, some of it, but actually it's really held the field back because, when you're speaking to a family, for example, if you're saying, yes, they're a bit not themselves or a bit confused after the surgery, this is quite common, then that's kind of mysterious to say that to a person. But if you say this is delirium, and here's a leaflet about delirium, we found that that's extremely helpful to families and patients, to make sense of what is often one of the most frightening experiences of their whole life. So it can't be trivialized. So I think, thankfully, we're seeing, in the UK at least, we just did some analysis of coding in hospital administrative databases. And in, for example, 90-year-olds and over, it's the delirium appearing in discharge summaries across the whole UK, all hospitals, has gone from about 3.5% to about 15% in the last 8 to 10 years. So I think we're beginning to see the value of all this awareness raising and education that we're doing. Mm-hmm. So I think we're really just keen that people use the word delirium as per the official definition, because I think it makes everything easier for research, for communication with families and so on.
Heidi, I was going to ask you you said you're working at the bedside and your whole body of work is on delirium. Tell us about kind of the prevalence. Like, what are we hear different numbers with, surgical patients. I know this is not just specific to surgical patients, but what are you finding to be, the incidence of this?
With COVID, we have seen a great increase in the prevalence rates. In the medical ICU, and people who are mechanically ventilated or have that breathing tube, it's upwards between 75% to 80%. In non-intubated ICU patients, it drops down to about 40 to 50%. Again, that depends on the institution, sometimes the tool used. But then in surgical patients, research studies have reported, and I'm sure you have talked about this before, but anywhere from like 10 to 50%, especially as you get into older adults with hip fractures. And then I think with medical patients, I think it's still 10 to 30% as well. So it's highly prevalent. It always strikes me when I'm outside of kind of like my delirium world, I'm talking to people in the public and I mention what I do and they're like, what's delirium? So I describe it. I'm like, oh, it's this confusion that people will experience in the hospital. And it's, it's really detrimental. People will have, see things, hear things that aren't there, but they're real to them. And they're like, oh yeah, well, my uncle or my dad or my mom or my sister, Oh, it never fails. People have stories about delirium. It's just that we haven't used a common language up until now to really spread that public awareness of this is what it is, and this is what you can expect, and it's dangerous, and we can stop it.
Yeah, absolutely. Monty, you've done some work in this space, haven't you, in your experience in critical care?
Yeah, involved in doing reasonably large observational studies that reinforces everything that we've heard, but also some of the long-term scarring in critically ill patients who start with a diagnosis of delirium, and then if you follow them up in detail for weeks, months, and years to follow, there's a very high incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder, which may or may not be driven and may or may not be modifiable by the acute delirious state. And we did find some associated factors like, for example, the use of benzodiazepines to try and stop delirium might drive delirium, and so on.
Yeah, we've defined it. We've talked about, the prevalence of it. Alasdair, do you want to talk to us a little bit about who's at greatest risk for delirium?
Yes, well, delirium can affect anybody, but the highest risk occurs in children or in older people. And in older people, it's modified a lot by whether there's pre-existing cognitive impairment, especially dementia, and also frailty, which is a term that describes an inability to respond in the face of stress. So people with lots of illness, for example, are often like that. So when they have a relatively mild illness to somebody who's fitter and younger, it becomes catastrophic for that person. So these are the main groups. And also, of course, it happens more when there is a more serious illness, so a severe pneumonia. For example, we saw that with COVID, lots of delirium occurring with COVID, especially when the COVID was severe. In fact, in older people, about almost half of them had delirium as part of their COVID syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd love to, in the future, take a deep dive on kind of some of the, ideas of why, they're experiencing those symptoms and delirium. So we'll definitely come back to that later on. But Heidi, I just wanted to ask you, Monty had mentioned a couple of things, by benzodiazepines, people being on the ventilator. What are some of the things that, we're seeing for post-surgical patients? Because a lot of our listeners are, perioperative medicine providers. What are some of the things that we should avoid and that you're seeing that can really affect this? And how do we really treat this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think in post-surgical patients, definitely avoiding benzodiazepines, because those are a deliriogenic medication, anticholinergics as well. I think avoiding keeping someone in bed and not promoting early mobility. Early mobility is so important, along with, reorientation, there's cognitive stimulation, and that can be anything from like conversation to reminiscing to telling stories, anything like that can help stimulate the brain. And so it's really the non-pharmacologicals that we have that prevent and reduce the severity and duration of delirium. That also includes like maintaining that sleep-wake cycle. So keeping someone up during the day, active with that early mobility so they can actually sleep at night. And I think the more we can cluster cares at night, so we're not going in at every hour or odd hours to wake someone up or poke them, is really, really helpful. Same thing with like hydration, eating. It's kind of like, I always say, it's like making sure someone's a human in the hospital. And then after surgery, they're actually able to return to that normal function because the hospital environment is so foreign to so many.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Rakesh, the ERAS Cardiac Society, we just had met and talked a lot about ERAS. And, that's Monty and I's background as well. Talk to us about, some of the things that the different societies are doing to help with this.
The benefits of enhanced recovery after surgery is that it packages all the processes that really target the vulnerabilities. I'm going to speak primarily for the older adult because that's the world I live in that 22 or 23 step plan. So all the issues with regards to preoperative optimization to address frailty, both from a physical component, a nutrition component, and a cognitive or mindfulness components up front in the preoperative preparation, as well as identifying risk. So I think if you have patients that have certain key risk factors that both Heidi and Alasdair have talked about, and you have that as your mindset as a team going in, that this patient will have vulnerabilities different than perhaps other ones. That's the first trick, is identification of risk. In the operating room, we're learning what a delirium anesthetic may look like in terms of minimizing longer-term narcotics. Certainly they're given in the anesthetic, avoidance of benzos in the entire perioperative phase, and then appropriate pain management post-operatively that's multimodal to minimize the over-reliance on things like opioids and others for pain management post-operatively. Then the things that Heidi talked about are also really critical about mobilization. I think in cardiac surgery, we've done this pretty well for the routine patient. For those patients that tend to be a bit sicker and more frail, we probably have not done as well. So really keeping those same processes in place about mobilization and so forth, as well as nutrition post-operatively. And then the ward prevents new challenges. While we have very good tools for screening for delirium in the ICU, it's probably less good for the ward. I know Alasdair's done a lot of work in this area, as others, developing the right kind of tools that are clinically feasible to look for delirium in the post-operative patient, to identify it as early as possible and target those risk factors. And the last thing that I just took my own soapbox to stand on as we're talking about World Delirium Awareness Day is using the right terminology. And I think we've talked a little bit about this today as well, as we use perhaps a lot of euphemisms. Because delirium is so common, it's deemed as being just part of care, particularly when dealing with perhaps older adults. And that's not okay. And that's one of the main messages we have. Just because it occurs doesn't mean that it's normal. And when we use terms like, well, they're pleasantly confused, it's an anathema to me to some degree, that it's one of those things we don't say, well, that person's got really beautiful heart failure, or that's really attractive hypoxemia. If someone's confused post-operatively, it's a medical emergency, and we need to use the right terminology. And I think as awareness for our teams, being attuned to that is really important as well.
Yeah, so wonderful that we can partner and get this information about iDelirium and World Delirium Awareness Day. So tell us about what you guys are doing today to help promote awareness for this. Heidi, do you want to take that?
So we're in the midst of our 36 hours of delirium programming that we've put together. It started with the Delirium Marchathon, starting March 1st to March 17th, and then 8 a.m. Australia time. That would have been about, I think 4 o'clock on the 16th Central time in the US. We launched the delirium programming. And so we've had content from South Korea, Japan, Australia, Zambia, Africa, Germany, Italy, Norway, Denmark, England, Scotland, Ireland, Canada, US, Brazil, Mexico. It's pretty incredible. And it's still going on. We're having some live events as well. So I'm really excited to have all that information out there. And it's super inspirational to see people get together across the globe to raise delirium awareness, because it is something that we can stop and prevent. And it's so critical to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And Alasdair, if people want to get involved in all the different organizations, across the world, where's the best place to find that information?
Well, each organization has a good website, which gives information about upcoming meetings. And in fact, this year we've got a full set of meetings. The American Delirium Society's meeting in June. And that's going to be an absolutely terrific 3-day meeting with a pre-con teaching day and then 2 full days of extremely good scientific content. It's all virtual. And then the Australasian Delirium Society is having a hybrid meeting. I think they're going to have some local attendees, but obviously not people from elsewhere. That's, I think, in late August. And then the European meeting, which will be virtual only, will be in November. And these are the 3 big delirium meetings internationally. And that's where really many of the world's active researchers and clinicians gather, along with many other people who are not necessarily contributing, but just want to come and learn about it. So the websites are a great place. I think Twitters are also a great place to, the hashtag WDAD 2021 will be where it's at, to keep up with what's happening today. And the website iDelirium.org is the hub of iDelirium, and that will have updates on what's going on, as well as at some point access to all the talks that are being broadcast in a 36-hour day.
Yeah, that's great. We went on this website and fantastic content already up there. It really is great.
Really cool.
Yeah, really good. And then I saw hashtag Delirium Aware. So that's something we can follow every day, right? We can, in our practices. Well, you all, this is so wonderful. Thank you for reaching out to TopMedTalk. I am so excited that we can partner on this and go forward to promote delirium awareness. Monty, we actually have our World Congress, the World Congress of Preoperative Medicine, coming up this summer.
So back end of June, early July, we've done the World Congress before. It's usually a physical event in London. And this year we're hoping it's going to be hybrid, which is a term that's bandied around now. We're going to deliver the content as we did last year, fully virtually, so it can be watched anywhere. But we're already getting people signing up to put on events in their own place. So somebody's just from Cardiff, for example, has just let us know that they're planning to book a room to get people to assemble locally to enjoy it. So hopefully iDelirium can come and join us as well, which would be great.
That's right.
And we did last year. We did our first Pockapalooza, which was we tried to go around the globe. We foolishly tried to stay awake from it, which resulted in being delirious at the end of it.
Yes. Who tried to stay awake, Monty? That was me. Yeah, 24 hours around the world for our perioperative care festival was the Pockapalooza. So hopefully we can have iDelirium involved this year. So that would be fantastic. Guys, thank you again so much. Good luck in all your efforts. Again, hashtag WDAD 2021 World Delirium Awareness Day. You can find them at iDelirium.org. And we look forward to future conversations. This is fantastic.
TopMedTalk.
Thanks for listening to TopMedTalk. We are excited to announce the World Congress of Perioperative Medicine happening in London this year. Check it out at ebpom.org. It will take you through to our carbon-free conference center where it has the EBPOM platform. You can find more information. Be sure to subscribe to TopMedTalk and EBPOM at ebpom.org.